Hello, this is Grant Irons from AWS Educate. Thank you for joining the Supporting the Rapid Transition to Remote Learning webinar series from Amazon Web Services. Educators all over the world are rapidly transitioning to remote learning, some for the very first time, and we wanted to help ease that transition. This webinar series was created for educators by educators who have expertise in remote learning and can share their insights with you. Please refer to the website to access recordings of past webinars in over 100 languages through subtitles. You'll be muted during this webinar, but we want to hear from you, so please put your questions in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer throughout the presentation and also have time set aside at the end to answer more questions. Note that this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to both the recording and a certificate of attendance following the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce Morgan Nixon for part 1 of Online Engagement Strategies for English Language Learners.
Thank you so much, Grant, for inviting me to speak with such a wonderful group of educators today. And hello, everyone from around the world. As Grant mentioned, my name is Morgan Nixon. I am an instructional designer and online course developer for English language educators with TESOL International Association. I am passionate about understanding the needs of English language learners for both students and educators, and designing engaging learning experiences for global classrooms to support those needs. I taught in South Korea and Tokyo, Japan, and have conducted teacher training in Peru. And I'm a recent graduate of Harvard's Graduate School of Education in Technology, Innovation, and Education. I listed my email to get in touch with me if you have any further questions after our webinar, and I am more than happy to stay connected. As a course developer for TESOL, I'd like to point out the vast resources that TESOL International Association is offering in order to prepare teachers to work with English language learners around the globe. We have developed a number of free online resources in our TESOL Resource Center and on our My TESOL COVID-19 resources group for educators to dive into. We have 80 plus publications available to inform you of best practices with English learners. And we have new online courses that educators can enroll in, including Foundations of TESOL, the 6 Principles for Exemplary Teaching of English Learners for K through 12, and Supporting English Language Learners with Exceptional Needs. You can find out more information about all of TESOL's resources at the websites listed. So I'm excited to work with everyone today and hopefully spark some inspiration for your online instructional approaches. So let's get started. So certainly you enrolled in this webinar to get practical strategies for not simply teaching English learners online, but rather engaging English learners online. So in order to support our learners, it is essential that we take a step back and ask ourselves, what does it truly mean to be an English language educator? Sure, working with English learners involves teaching the 4 language skills, but English learners come to class with different needs, stories, backgrounds, traditions, and simply remembering this one fact, we can transform from being teachers of language to being support systems, advocates, mentors, collaborators, resources for colleagues, designers, and policymakers. So while participating in this webinar, I'd like to ask that you not simply think about what activities you can do with students and what technology you can use, but rather ask yourself, how can you as an educator to English language learners understand the circumstances of online learning for your students and embrace pedagogical practices that support the well-being and learning of students in their lives as a whole? Seeing as though each and every student and classroom is different, we might ask ourselves how these strategies presented in today's webinar can be adapted for varying contexts. While there has been an abrupt change in education, we as educators can make the necessary decisions to see these as opportunities to engage with our students in different ways and challenge our own practices that we have been doing for so long. We truly have the power to move from having learners read on screen to being seen as integral components of the language learning system. So it starts with us. So with that being said, I'd like to invite you to engage in a brief reflection. I'll read our warm-up question. The warm-up question is this: what is one improvement that you would like to make to your online teaching delivery for English learners? Step 1, read the question in yellow. Step 2, write your answer in the chat box. Step 3, review the comments from others in the webinar. Take 30 seconds to write your answer in the chat box. Now, take 30 seconds to read the responses from our global community members. Thank you for your responses. So, as you can see, there are countless opportunities for us to reflect and grow as educators. Some you may not have considered in your own practice. Today, we will start from the beginning of a learning experience by discussing how to interact with and check in with learners. Then, we will discuss ways to scaffold or provide support for the information we are teaching. Then, we will review ways that we can engage and have fun with our learners once we have built these scaffolds. Hopefully, I can help shed some light onto how to transform these improvements that you mentioned in the previous question into inspiration. It's important to note that the following strategies can be incorporated within already existing structures, and what you are doing now can be enhanced by strategies for greater learning experiences. The first characteristic of online learning that I'd like to address is the need for increased interaction and check-ins. Now, why do I say this? In face-to-face classes, noticing if students are falling behind in class is a bit easier, right? We can see it on their faces. We can see if they're looking out the window or talking to a friend. If they're working on an assignment, we can see if they're writing or engaging with the assignment. The visual cues are more apparent. Now, in online classes, not so much. We can, of course, see if students are logging into class, but what if our students don't have the internet? What if our students aren't understanding the instructions to an assignment? What if our students have questions that they can't ask during the live session? What do we ask as English language educators in order to support students in not simply logging into the course, but also interacting with the course content and participating in activities? So here is strategy 1 for interacting and checking in. Create clear instructions for course access. It's important that we begin by providing clear instructions for our learners. Take 10 seconds to think about what you noticed about our warm-up question. Our instructions in the warm-up question clearly indicated the question being asked. They included numbered steps, they began with the action, and they included color coordination between the instructions and the question. When creating instructions for English learners, it is important to follow these steps. Say you want your students to log into Google Classroom. Remember, instead of telling students to log on to Google Classroom, provide a numbered instruction sheet and video on how they can log on. Be sure that you use short sentences and the same language for different technology actions. For instance, always use the word click if you want learners to click. Always use the word scroll down instead of go down if you want learners to scroll down a web page. Send these instructions in multiple formats. For instance, through email and group text. Provide a matching worksheet or activity like a scavenger hunt for learners to become familiar with a system that they are going to have to use in their online learning experience. Strategy 2, understand the basic characteristics of English learners. It is extremely important that we remember the circumstances that our learners are facing. Not only are all learners learning from home, but also our English learners may be facing challenges that we are unaware of, including challenges with immigration status, their parents' employment status, stress at home, and much more. It is important that we remember not to create cognitive overload. Take it slow. Be sure that you are facilitating check-ins with students and being flexible about their learning needs as well as their learning goals. This is the perfect opportunity to get to know your students and their background even more. By understanding your learners' needs, you can better create a warm atmosphere and positive conditions for learning. Call your students. Ask how they're doing in this time. Speak with their parents. Understand that being a teacher is more than teaching content. It is also making sure that your students are content in the classroom. Strategy 3, check understanding frequently. As I mentioned before, when teaching online, it might be difficult to truly understand how learners are doing at a particular moment in our lesson. If we are engaging in a video lesson, we could simply ask. But rather than have students respond by all speaking at once, they can hold up their thumb to indicate if they understand or need more help. They could also choose an item that they designate as their I'm doing okay item or their I need more help item. For instance, they might hold up a teddy bear if they're doing great, but they may hold up their superhero action figure if they need more help. By keeping a personal record of these items, learners can more privately indicate their level of comfort with a topic instead of publicly announcing it to the class. Strategy 4, host one-on-one meetings with students. We can host one-on-one meetings with students at various points throughout the week via 10-minute check-ins. These can be routine meetings where students have a set time that they can meet with you to ask questions that they may not want to ask during a live online session. If they have questions about instructions on an assignment or would like you to provide extra speaking practice for them, these one-on-one meetings are the place to do it. Send out calendar invitations to remind students using online calendars, or simply call or send a text message. For more interactions and check-ins, view Part 2 of the webinar. A link to Part 2 can be found at the end of the presentation and also in the notes below. Though we are not present in students' physical space, it is still necessary to remain present in our students' everyday lives. Consider ways that you can check in with students and give spaces for them to individually ask questions and engage with you as a teacher personally. Be sure to take away these main points. Remain present despite the distance. Give spaces for students to ask questions and engage personally. Find ways to get to know your students. Call your students and speak with them personally. Consider these questions as you create ways for your students to check in and interact. How can I ensure that my learners understand the learning goals with and without the use of technology? Can this assignment be adapted to be a journal activity, a phone call, a drawing? How can the assignment that I initially planned be changed to adapt to the circumstances that are being presented to me? And as a reminder, here's a list of the technology that I mentioned in this section. But let's not forget, there are always opportunities to innovate, online or offline. Feel empowered to create these opportunities. We talked about online applications for connecting with families, online forms, instant messaging, and different text and blog services. So let's engage now in a 30-second wrap-up question. Here's our question. Choose one strategy from this section. How can you take this idea and adapt it to your context? Step 1, read the question above in yellow. Step 2, type your answer in the chat box. Step 3, review the comments from others in the webinar. So let's take 30 seconds starting now. Thank you for your responses. So now you have one strategy that you can use in your classroom tomorrow, next week, next month, and really engage with your learners in their interactions and check-ins. So now let's move on to step 2, scaffolding techniques. The next strategy we will review is scaffolding information. This means that rather than providing information to English learners in the same way we would provide information to English speakers, we would create supports for learners to better understand the information. Think of a house. If the house does not have the correct foundation, it has cracks and the bricks aren't put together the way they should be, it will eventually fall apart. A house needs the correct support to be held up and remain standing for years. This is the same with students. All students actually, not simply English learners. If a student doesn't have the correct support to understand the instructions of a lesson or is not provided with help and organized information along the way, this student's rate of success will fall far behind. Here are a number of strategies that are used with English learners that will greatly transform their learning experiences in both online learning environments and offline learning environments. Strategy 1, model language. When learning a new language, it's important that we model the language that we expect students to produce. Imagine you're learning a new language and on top of that, you're in science class learning that new language. This is difficult for me to even comprehend. But this is what our learners are going through every day, and now in an online environment. Rather than creating an assignment like, write a paragraph about the components of a cell in the body and write what each component does, you can model this activity and the language you expect students to use by providing an example of each paragraph, or at least the first few sentences. In this paragraph, you could highlight or color code key features that must be included in the paragraph. For instance, an introduction or a conclusion. You could also include an example of what students should not do in order to facilitate deeper thinking. You could also include an example of what students should do and should not do in order to facilitate deeper thinking. For instance, you could write the model paragraph in green and highlight the aspects of the paragraph that should be included. For instance, a title, transition words, punctuation marks, and more. Underneath, you can include a paragraph in red that is not what is expected of learners, and circle places where information is missing or more information could be included. You could create a word bank for students to remember to use the vocabulary words in their paragraph. This word bank can be at the top of each assignment page. It could also be located on a designated page on your online learning system. For instance, if you're using Google Classrooms, you can have a page dedicated to new vocabulary for each lesson. Next to each word, you can include an audio recording of you saying that word aloud. It can also include a link to an online resource, like a video explaining the word in more detail. You could even link these pages to a Quizlet, an online flashcard application where users can practice vocabulary using text or images. You can record yourself speaking each vocabulary word and model how it should be pronounced. That way, if your learners do not recognize the spelling first, they can play the recording and associate the spelling of that word to the pronunciation of that word. Strategy 2, provide templates. Similarly to providing examples for students, providing templates allows students to understand the expectations of an assignment in order to perform on level. Say you want students to write an essay. That is a huge assignment for an English learner. What if you provided a template for the essay so that students would know what to write and where? You could have starting sentences on one side of the template, and then your learners could fill in their ideas on the other side. Clearly indicate the parts of the template that are the sentence starters by writing them in a bold color. You could create a template using a document creator. Then have students download a copyable version of the template so that they can download the template directly to their computers and work off of their own sheet. You could also send templates in the mail and have students write their essays on paper. Again, templates can be used for any assignment. In my course that I developed for English language educators with TESOL International Association, I used templates even with educators. When there were a lot of tasks or components of an assignment, templates were extremely helpful in the development of our course. Strategy 3, use visuals. When students are unfamiliar with a vocabulary word, they may have a better chance of recognizing and internalizing that vocabulary word if they were associated with a picture. When you give instructions, when you create a PowerPoint presentation, when you create anything in your classroom, match each concept or vocabulary word to a relatable visual so that students can remember it and be able to relate the word that they are seeing to a picture. Say you're a high school English language teacher and you're teaching a unit on personal narratives. You can use visuals to introduce both the vocabulary that's expected in the narrative and visuals to introduce the parts of a narrative. For instance, the vocabulary for this unit is born, grew up, went to school, graduated, felt excited, felt scared. I would use a picture to show each of these vocabulary words. I wouldn't only show the picture once. I would repeat showing the picture and vocabulary word over and over, or just the picture or just the vocabulary word throughout my lesson in order to ensure that students understand the word. I may even include the picture at the top of the assignment to make sure that students remember to include it in their writing. I could also use pictures to indicate the different parts of an essay. For instance, I might include a start sign at the side of the page to indicate where an introduction sentence should be written. I might use 2 arrows to show where a transition sentence might go. I might put a stop sign at the side to show where a conclusion should be. For more techniques, view part 2 of the webinar. A link to part 2 can be found at the end of the presentation and also in the notes below. So please remember, guide your students through a step-by-step process throughout each lesson, activity, and assignment. Understand that learners internalize language in a variety of ways. So provide multiple entry points and supports in order for learners to understand the language in order to understand the concepts. So here are a few takeaways. Provide step-by-step processes, understand the various ways that learners can internalize language, provide multiple entry points into one concept or vocabulary word, and remember, take a step back from your expertise and understand where a learner might need support. Here are a few questions to consider asking yourself when providing scaffolding for your students. How can I take a step back from the content to ensure that my students understand first? How can I set up systems in my class so that my students always know where to go for support? As a reminder, here's a list of the technology that I mentioned in this section. But let's not forget, There are always opportunities to innovate, online or offline. Feel empowered to create. We talked about online flashcard tools and online document writing tools. Let's do our 30-second wrap-up question. I'll read the question in yellow. Choose one strategy from this section. How can you take this idea and adapt it to your context? Step 1. Read the question above in yellow. Step 2. Write your answer in the chat box. Step 3. Review the comments from others in the webinar. Let's take 30 seconds starting now. Thanks so much for answering. Let's move on to engagement strategies. The second characteristic of online learning that I'd like to address is the need for meaningful engagement. Now, what do I mean when I say this? At the onset of the pandemic, so many teachers were sending home packets of worksheets for their students to complete. Understandably, this is an effective route for classrooms in a time of crisis. But what happens when students become bored of the monotony of packets of worksheets being sent home? What if the information presented in those packets has nothing to do with the lives of our students? What else can educators do to engage English learners in fun, meaningful activities? When students are able to connect knowledge to their lives, they are able to retain that knowledge for longer and better understand that information works within a larger system of the world that they're living in. This is true for all students, but especially English learners who may not even have learned this information in their home countries or in their first language. Let's explore some strategies. Strategy 1, chunk information. Chunk lessons in segments and keep the information short. So imagine you're taking an online class that lasts for 1 hour or 2 hours. Sitting in front of a computer for that time period can be quite overwhelming. Now, imagine doing so as a young learner or a teenager. And on top of this, you're an English language learner. It's a lot. So to combat this, educators can chunk the lessons both online and offline. Deliver a short amount of new information and then take a break from learning any new information and allow learners to practice that information for a short amount of time, but in a different style. So for instance, if learners are learning about the present tense and everyday routines, present this information for 10 to 15 minutes with time for on-screen practice. Then have learners take a 10-minute break to walk around their house to practice using the present tense to describe their everyday routines. They can report back on the sentences that they developed by taking a photo to share on the class blog or sending a photo in the group chat. Or they can simply share their sentence aloud once they return to class to the live session. If your young learners are practicing the alphabet, present the information for a few minutes. Send them to watch a sing-along video with the alphabet online. Then send them to find 5 items in their house that start with that letter in the alphabet. Be sure to send a message to the students to return to class. Brain breaks are also an option where between chunks, students are able to take 5 to 10 minute stretching, yoga, dance breaks, play puzzle games, and more. Remember, chunking can be done in many ways, but be sure not to present large amounts of information at once, but rather break the information into smaller pieces with various activities in between. Strategy 2, incorporate interactive videos. Because students may not be able to engage fully at a specific time and place, you can use your phone, tablet, or camera to record yourself teaching a lesson. These videos can even be chunked. It is not necessary to simply sit in front of a webcam and teach a lesson. You can record yourself standing up, engaging in activities, writing on a whiteboard, engaging in dialogue with your own family members. You can upload videos to YouTube and make them private to maintain a community feel. Students can comment on the lesson in the comment section. You can insert questions and answers into your videos and make them interactive using websites like TESOL and PlayPosit. For instance, imagine you're teaching a lesson about nature. Take a walk with your family safely in your neighborhood using the right precautions while also recording a video. As you walk down the street, record the dialogue between you and your family members as you point out various aspects of nature. You would say something like, "I see a tall tree." Using Edpuzzle or PlayPosit, the video would pause and ask a question that you create, and the question would appear like, "What do I see?" Students can choose the correct answer and seamlessly continue watching the rest of your video and answer more questions in between the video. Strategy 3, use interactive websites. There are a number of websites and resources that students can engage with to interact with language beyond simply sitting in front of a computer. Sure, as an educator, you have content that you need to teach your students, but also learners can engage with games and activities on the web that encourage interaction, already have valuable content, and allow you to take a break from creating materials from scratch. For English language learners, this direct interaction with language is essential for practice. BrainPop is an excellent tool that allows learners to engage with multiple subject areas and multiple skills. For instance, we can see that students can learn about famous authors and books with associated activities and quizzes. They can learn about various grammar points and even learn study skills and engage in writing activities. You can adapt the lessons on this website to support your classes. I also love Starfall for young learners, and I used this site while I was teaching elementary school in Korea. Starfall has phonics and reading activities for children to engage in multiple ways. With videos, say and repeat, songs, poems, short stories, everything can be found on this site. For older learners, more critical thinking is necessary, especially to support them with coping with today's news. Sites like Newsella and Breaking News English are excellent for allowing learners to read different news articles at different proficiency levels and then interact with new vocabulary and grammar skills in associated activities that are specific to that article. These sites can be incorporated into various content areas like history, social studies, and science as it relates to current events. I used Breaking News English when I taught at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and it was so effective in developing engagement and care about the world. So for an offline approach, you should try having students read an actual newspaper and then prompting students to reflect on particular questions in a journal. There are a number of adaptations for news articles and approaches to using news articles in your classrooms that allow learners to practice the language skills. Strategy 4, incorporate interactive videos. Learners can listen to stories online as well. Fairy tales and stories for kids is a great channel on the internet with stories for multiple proficiency levels that are engaging and colorful for children. Of course, this is just one example of the thousands of channels online. So do a search to find what works well for your learners and context. Because learning does not occur from only one source, it is essential that we engage our learners in multiple forms of language during their learning experience. For more engagement strategies, view part 2 of the webinar. A link to part 2 can be found at the end of the presentation and also in the notes below. So here are some takeaways for our engagement strategy section. Use interactive multimedia formats. Encourage multiple entry points for language. Find fun ways to rethink activities in your classroom. Use various resources both online and offline. use the current household environment as your classroom as well. Consider these questions as you create ways for your students to get the support that they need and engage in learning experiences. For example, how can I rethink my current activities using multiple media sources? How can I take what I have and what my students have and utilize it for learning? What can be a learning opportunity that I've never thought of before? As a reminder, here's a list of the technologies that I mentioned in this section. But let's not forget, there are always opportunities to innovate, online or offline. Feel empowered to create. So the technology that we talked about was Edpuzzle, PlayPosit, TED-Ed, BrainPop, Starfall, Newsella, and Breaking News English. So let's engage in our 30-second wrap-up question. I'll read the question in yellow. Choose one strategy from this section. How can you take this idea and adapt it to your context? Step 1, read the question above in yellow. Step 2, type your answer in the chat box. Step 3, review the comments from others in the webinar. Let's take 30 seconds, starting now. Thanks so much for answering. So you now have one strategy for engagement that you can use in your classroom context tomorrow, next week, or next month. Be sure to use it online. So as a review, here are the ideas that we talked about in today's webinar. We reviewed the ways in which we can get our English learners interacting and participating and logged into the course. We remembered that all learning does not have to be online, and how we can use technology that learners have outside of a computer to get them to interact. We also reviewed different supports that we can provide our learners to ensure their understanding of everything from instructions to content to their learning goals. Lastly, we reviewed engagement strategies, and we reconsidered ways that our everyday lessons can be spruced up to include fun, engaging opportunities for learning that we may not have considered before. You also now have 3 new strategies from our wrap-up questions after each section, where you closely considered how each strategy could be adapted for your own teaching context. Thank you so much for your participation in part 1. Continue to part 2 of the webinar for more strategies. A link to part 2 can be found at the end of the presentation and also in the notes below. And of course, happy Teacher Appreciation Week. Thank you so much for your service.
Thank you, Morgan, and thanks for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you everyone for your active participation through the questions pane. We really appreciate all the questions and comments. As I mentioned earlier, you can find information for both the webinar series and office hours on our webpage, found on the screen and in chat. Also, a link to the recording of this webinar and a certificate of completion will be sent to you via email within 4 hours. Lastly, you will see a survey pop up when you close the webinar. Please provide your feedback on the survey so we can continue to improve these webinars. Now, we will continue to answer questions until the top of the hour. All right, thanks for joining everyone. And Morgan, thanks again for the great presentation. So interesting to hear how you engage with English language learners. We have some really good questions that have come in, so I wanted to see if we could get you to answer those questions. Can you hear me, Morgan?
Yes, I can.
Ah, fantastic. So let's get started. First of all, how do you help English learners with technology, such as getting to a website or using tools you mentioned like Google Docs, when all of those tools are in English?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Grant. I think that it starts by scaffolding. And we spoke about this in section. It's so important that teachers provide outlined instructions and tutorials for students in order to get them online and on the websites that they need to be on in order to interact with the content. So that includes numbering, instructions, color coding, action words, and also providing videos of yourself engaging with the tools. So say you want to have your learners engage with a collaborative document or research an idea online, you can record yourself um, with a screencast video in order to teach students how to do that. Because for a lot of students, it's their first time um, going to these websites. So it's really important that we scaffold that instruction and have them engage with this information in a step-by-step process. And I want to emphasize the fact that it's important to start with those action words. What is it that you want learners to do? Do you want learners to click, scroll? Do you want learners to download? I think starting with those action words is necessary, and using those same action words throughout the learning experiences will definitely help learners understand the technology and the actions that are necessary to engage with the technology. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking.
Yes, and thank you. Thanks for the thorough response. Morgan, another question came in. Can you please tell which particular strategy we need to concentrate on in online teaching?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question as well. You know, what's so special about teaching English language learners and just teaching in general is that every classroom is different. So, what I need to focus on for my learners is going to be completely different from what somebody maybe in India or Japan will focus on with their learners. So, what's important first is to understand your learners. So that's the first strategy. What are your learners' needs? What in this particular moment do learners need to focus on in order to actively engage in the classroom? What are their backgrounds? What are their home languages? What are their best, ways of connecting learners? Do they like to hear information? Are they visual learners? Do they like to move around? Are they kinesthetic learners? So understanding their different learning styles will definitely help you with developing activities that are suitable for their needs. Once you understand that learners have different learning styles and backgrounds and needs, and once you begin developing these activities, it's essential to scaffold their learning experiences. So yes, you can play a million videos for an auditory learner, but if they don't understand how to access that information or the vocabulary in that information, I think first taking a step back and understanding how, through a step by step process, can I allow my learners to access this information in multiple ways will definitely help support their learning experiences. And that's probably where any learner, or sorry, any teacher should start. Understand and support.
Makes perfect sense. I like how you talk a lot about the relationship and relationship with students. You mentioned relationship with parents, and through that relationship, you get to know what the students want and need to be able to meet their needs. So
Right.
really good points.
It's so important. So important.
Yes. Yes. And another thing that you mentioned, you talked about relationship with parents and being sure to be able to communicate with the parents. How do you communicate with parents whose native language is not English? And you mentioned this earlier, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
That is such a great point. And actually, we touch on that in part 2 of the webinar. So, just as a teaser for part 2, we talk about an application for that teachers can use. That actually, when you send a message in this application called Talking Points, it translates the information to their home language. So that's a great application to use as well. Now, it's also important to remember that being a teacher it means that you are part of a learning community. So if there's information that needs to be translated, or another language that your a parent speaks that you don't speak, perhaps there is someone else in that community that can help you get the information that you need delivered to the parents and the family members. So please remember, you are not isolated in the learning experience and the ecosystem of the school. It is so important that we work together with other teachers, administration, and especially community organizations that can better serve your learners. So doing a little bit of research on your end, um, to understand how to interact with parents as well is really important. And again, just as relationships are important, reaching out to parents, giving them a call, sending them a text message in very simple language, if they don't speak English, can really help with their understanding their child's learning experience. And again, those same principles that we use with students can apply to parents as well. So if we send home a document with 3 paragraphs of information, and we know that parents may not speak English, that might not be the best way to communicate with parents. Why can't we send them worksheets or documents with visuals as well, to allow them to be integrated into their child's learning experience? So remember to include parents, but also meet them at the level, at the language level where they're coming from as well. It's so important to build that relationship and build it with understanding that learners and parents are coming from different areas.
That makes perfect sense. So I want to transition a little bit to maybe an upper level student, or a teacher that is not directly teaching English, but is teaching science or math or social studies to a non-native speaker. So can you
Right.
give some tips for those teachers? They obviously aren't going to speak, or may not speak, the student's native language, but how can they adapt their lesson and their communication to meet the needs of those students?
Right. We talk about this a lot in part two as well. um, and say you are a science teacher or a math teacher. And I say that first because I am not that great in science or math. So I can totally understand where any learner is coming from if they are having difficulty with these subjects. But this is where the scaffolding comes in. And especially with vocabulary, because in order for a student to understand the general concepts, for example, the cycles or the processes involved in science and math, it's important for them to understand the vocabulary first. So, really take time for learners to learn vocabulary and provide ways to interact with the vocabulary in multiple occasions over and over again. So instead of, just for example, if we're in science class and we're talking about the water cycle, instead of just talking about the water cycle and the gases and everything that's involved in that process, take a step back, break down the vocabulary that's associated with the water cycle. Again, here's where we can use visuals to attach pictures or um, videos to each vocabulary word. Color code vocabulary so that every time they see, a large amount of text, they understand the vocabulary that's associated with that text. Record yourself saying the vocabulary word, because as we mentioned, some learners, they can understand vocabulary through hearing, but when they see it on paper, it's a different story. They might not understand. So associate vocabulary with both, audio and visual in order for students to understand the various aspects. So really take time to have learners learn the vocabulary and also engage with the vocabulary, and have comprehension checks as well throughout the class. So imagine you're having a class and you're talking all about the water cycle, and then in the middle of your speech you can just stop and say, okay, let's do a comprehension check. What does this vocabulary word mean? And then we can answer. Some learners might submit their answers through chat. You can ask learners privately. There's so many ways to engage with that vocabulary. Even if you're a content teacher, just take a step back first. Sorry, that was a long answer. I just get excited.
No, that was a great answer. And it sounds like these are techniques that can be used with all students, not just English language learners. So I love it.
Yeah. And that's what's so special about teaching English language learners is really these are basic principles that can apply to all teachers. And it's interesting. Imagine if all teachers worked, with the same exact principles as English language learning teachers do, with the understanding learners, really truly understanding and creating these conditions for learning. All students would just catapult into learning experiences that are tailored for them and personalized for their learning.
Love it. Morgan, I have one more question for you.
Yes.
How do you deliver learning to students who are reluctant and who don't really want to talk and contribute?
That is such a great question. And this happens in face-to-face environments, and it's even, of a bigger issue when it's in online learning environments because this is new. This again goes back to understanding learners. And if we understand their learning styles, we can create learning experiences for them in different ways. So for example, maybe we have an assignment and the assignment that is needed to be submitted is a video. Well, not all learners, want to submit videos. They might be shy or reluctant, as you mentioned. Well, this is where we can have options for learners. So always provide options so that learners can submit their assignments in different ways. So I might ask in this instance, in this example, I might ask students to maybe submit a writing or a journal entry. I love journals because they're so personal. And it's kind of like a conversation between you and the learner. And this is where a lot of, you can really develop a relationship with a learner, even through text and through personal journals. So that's a great idea. But always provide options for assignment submission. Not everyone is outgoing. And just think about yourself and maybe how you might want to engage with an assignment or not engage with an assignment, and understand that feeling of that an English language learner might bring to the classroom as well. So options are a great tool. Thanks so much for the question.
I love it. Thank you very much. And it looks like we don't have any other questions that have come in. We'll give one last call for questions for Morgan. Okay, it seems like you've answered them all. Morgan, thank you so much for this. I want to encourage everyone to watch part 2 because it's just as much good information. It's available using the link on the screen as well as the link in chat. Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Morgan.
Thank you. Happy Teachers Week.